back to Before the Day Ends and our series on Matthew. Last time we talked a little bit about the Bible and asked the question, is it trustworthy? Well, today we're going to go a little closer to actually getting into the Gospel of Matthew, but to do that I want to just give some background. Now this may take us a couple of these 10-minute sessions, but I think it's worth it. I want to kind of present it as a story, but it's important that you kind of have some context. A lot of what Jesus says is better understood if we know what's going on around them. And also, too, what were the people that were Matthew's audience, that were Jesus's audience, what were they looking for? What were their expectations? What were they hoping for? And then how does that relate to our lives today? Do we have some of the same concerns, some of the same hopes, and some of the same challenges? So again, we're going to just give a little historical overview, hopefully make this kind of fun in some ways to kind of just go through what happened and some of the high points in Jewish history leading up to the New Testament and the time of Jesus. Okay, to start off with, we want to take a look at the fact that this story doesn't occur in isolation, that Matthew has a perspective for his audience. And so Matthew's perspective is generally directed toward a Jewish audience. And so he's going to have characters, connections to history that best reflect that perspective. So let's start there. One of the first big figures in Jewish history is Abraham. And he becomes, through covenants with God, the father of this chosen nation of God. And God gives him really two promises. One is for a nation, and second is for land. And so again, this is the first real big covenant. So land and nation are really important. He has some children, Isaac, and then Isaac has a son, Jacob. And so this story begins to then fall out into this family as it begins to develop. Also, to note that Abraham was kind of out of nowhere. He was this nomadic shepherd herder that God then selects for his mission in the world. During the time of Jacob, the family is forced to go down and live in Egypt, Goshen in particular, because of a famine. If you know the story of Joseph, that's where you're going to see that story kind of unfold. They lived there for 400 years. At some point in that period, we don't know how long, the Israelites were slaves in Egypt. And they are rescued, they are brought out because God chooses someone to set his people free. And that person, as you know, is Moses. And Moses, too, is this kind of rags to riches, really actually, he's riches to rags to riches story. He grew up in Pharaoh's household, although he was Hebrew. He grows up in Pharaoh's household until one day at 40 years old, he kills an Egyptian slave. He then escapes to a place called Midian, where he spends the next 40 years as a shepherd. Again, a nobody in nowhere land. And that's when God chooses him. God calls him with the burning bush to go and rescue his people. And at 80 years old, Moses does that. We have the Exodus, we have the crossing of the Red Sea, and God gives Moses the Torah for the people, the instructions, the more specifically 10 commandments as well. And so Moses then gets this second really big covenant for God's people, and that is Torah. That is God's instructions set for them. Okay, now after Moses, we have the people going into the land under Joshua. There's a period called the Judges, which are kind of ups and downs. When people did well, they were blessed. When they did not so well, they were cursed. And that period ends with the prophet Samuel, or the judge Samuel, who then selects the next and first king of Israel, which will be Saul. Saul doesn't hold faith with God, and so God replaces Saul with our next big figure, and that is David, who again was a nowhere character, a shepherd boy, excluded for the most part, and yet he is chosen by God to be Israel's second king and really the golden age of Israel. And he is given a promise with God, and that is to have a kingdom, to have a kingship, that someone from his line would be on the throne. And so now we have these collection, if you will, of covenants. You have Abraham's covenant of land and a nation, Moses' covenant of having Torah, and then you have the Davidic covenant of having a king on the throne. So we have these three major covenants that are going to be shaping what's going to go on in the Gospel of Matthew. And by the way, since all three of these characters, Abraham, Moses, and David, really come from small town, nowhere kind of backgrounds into the spotlight, we're going to see the same thing with Jesus, right? Born in Nazareth, or born in Bethlehem, goes up in Nazareth. And even it said of Nazareth that this is a nowhere kind of place. And yet, that's where God is going to call his Messiah from. So again, three big markers, three big covenants. Now, the one most important of these three is going to be Moses. And we'll see how that plays out in the first 3 or 4 chapters of Matthew. All right, so a little bit more history, and we're going to kind of cover up through maybe the exile right now today. So after David, Solomon takes over, his son. He builds the first temple, very wise, and writes a lot of wisdom literature that's in the Old Testament. However, makes some bad decisions, makes some alliances that are not helpful for Israel and against what God wanted. And so God sees this happening and says, this is not good. And then Solomon's son, Rehoboam, pushes burdens onto the people, makes them build things and forces them into forced labor. And because of that, the nation splits. And it splits into two. 10 tribes in the north, that's called Ephraim or Israel, and 2 tribes in the south, which is called Judah. Now the northern kingdom, those 10 tribes in the north, they don't do very well very long. And because they split faith with God, God sends Assyria to destroy them. And in 722, Assyria destroys the northern kingdom. When I say destroys, I mean he wipes them out. They intermarry with people there, their culture is destroyed, their genetic history is destroyed, their identity is destroyed. And in fact, later in the New Testament, we'll see the descendants of these folks called Samaritans. And they were outcasts when it came to the Jewish people. All right, the northern tribe, or the southern tribe rather, lasts a bit longer. They last until 586 under the kings of the southern kingdom, who are then attacked by the king of Babylon now, who has taken over in the east. And Nebuchadnezzar comes to Jerusalem, lays siege to it, destroys the first temple, ransacks the city. But the difference between Babylon and Assyria's approach is that Babylon takes a lot of the Jewish population and exiles them back to Babylon. So they're able to hold together some sense of who they are as they're now in exile. However, look back at the promises we had from Abraham. Their nation is gone. Right? Their land is gone. Their king is now the king of Babylon. So that king is gone. They have Torah. They have the promises in the covenant of God's instruction to them. And so they will hold desperately onto that, try to rebuild themselves in exile, which they do, living in exile for 70 years. Now, they return in 539 under the now Persian Empire. And when Cyrus of Persia takes over from Babylon, he wants to create goodwill with the people he now controls. And so he lets the Jews go back to Jerusalem and build the second temple, which is completed by 515. So now we're in what's called the Second Temple period. They're back in the land. They still have Torah, but they still have a different king. There's still no Davidic king. They're still paying huge amounts of money to taxes. They're still oppressed, but at least they're in the land and they still have Torah, and now they've built the second temple. And this is kind of where the Old Testament closes. So now we have some material we have to take a look at between the close of the Old Testament and the time of Jesus. How do we get from the Persians to the Romans? What were the hopes that take place between this period of being taxed, living the land but not really owning it, to not having a king? How do those promises get fulfilled? And what are the people looking for in this period of uncertainty? And again, in our world today, a lot of uncertainty. We wonder who's in control, what's going to happen next. And so some of these concerns that they may be having in this period, we may have today. So let's take a break now, and we'll continue this next time as we look at the history of the Gospel of Matthew.